Good morning, everybody. This is Chris with DC Time. Obviously, Dean is not with me. Dean and Amy are fighting COVID this week. They got a positive test this past week, and so I'm thinking about them and praying for their recovery. It sounds like Amy's doing a little bit better. Dean's still struggling a little bit, but he is on the mend, and real soon we'll be back together again to bring you another message. Currently, today, I've been going over some words. I tend to circle in on words that Paul uses. Many of you know here we like to focus on Paul's letters. We think they're very specific to the time we live in. And so today I was looking at certain words, and the word fruit kept coming up. Fruit, and then consequently first fruits. And some really great scripture about those. In fact, let me just go to Colossians 1:10. And there we have, let's see. Well, let me go back up to 9. Therefore, we also, from the day on which we hear, do not cease praying for you and requesting that you may be filled full with the realization of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, you to walk worthy of the Lord, for all pleasing, bearing fruit in every good work, and growing in the realization of God, being endued with all power in accord with the might of his glory. In addition to that, we've got Galatians 5:22, which is a great one. Now the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, meekness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. In addition to those, I have, let's see, 1 Corinthians 20 and 21. Yet now Christ has been roused from among the dead, the first fruit of those who are reposing. And then also I wanted to go to Romans 8:23. Yet not only so, but we ourselves also who have the first fruit of the Spirit, we ourselves are groaning in ourselves, awaiting the sonship, the deliverance of our body. Now, obviously, these references to the word fruit and first fruit, we're not talking about the fruit that comes from vegetation, you know. I actually was looking up some of those things, and it was interesting. The definition for first fruit would be the earliest gathered fruit offered to a deity in acknowledgement of the gift of fruitfulness. We see that in Cain and Abel and their approach present to God, and they're giving God the first fruits of their harvest. We know that the Old Testament has many places where first fruits were gathered. Even a first fruit could be the first calf of a cattle, and it would be designated as a gift to God and given over to a priest as an offering. So we have a lot of these metaphors in the scriptures about fruit being a yield, something that comes from an endeavor. It becomes a product, like the fruits of the Spirit. All of this is really interesting, and I began realizing the more I thought about these things, my father-in-law kept popping up in my mind. I had to stop for a second and try to figure out why was Tom coming up in my mind. My father-in-law, Tom Clark, has been gone now for almost 22 years. He died in October of 2000. And then I began to realize it's because my father-in-law was a nut about fruits and vegetables. He grew a huge vegetable garden, and he had tons of fruit trees on his property. And the more I considered what I was thinking, I thought, boy, there's another example of how God provides. I am fortunate enough to have the parents that I have. They are tremendous, great parents. Wouldn't take anything for them. But that wasn't enough for God. He also had to put in my life two in-laws, my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, Tom and June Clark. And the significance of these two people in my life, obviously I could not see it at 18, 19 years of age. But as my life has moved on and as I've grown in my understanding of the Father and how precise He is and how He gives so abundantly, it became obvious to me as I was studying these words who Tom was to me. And I guess that's kind of what I wanted to share, was another example of the Father providing by putting this person in my life. Tom was a great guy. He worked at the post office for over 35 years, I believe. But Tom grew an enormous garden. He had 13 acres. And it was a great therapeutic thing for him. He loved it. Most of what he loved was the yield, when the things came in and he could share them with other people. His kids, my wife included, they would tell stories of how he would take his family to church and drop them off at church. And then Tom would go to the people of that church who were shut in because of infirmities or, their health wasn't such. And he would take tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, potatoes, apples, pears, peaches, plums. He would take all this produce to them and drop it off at their house while the kids were at church. And that was his way of serving people, was to bring this work that he had done from March, all the way through summer. He would do all this labor in his garden, and then he would take all these fruits and give them to people so he could, and he just loved when you talked about the different things that he could provide and how good they were. My mother-in-law canned all these things, preserved all these things, cooked all these things. She had an applesauce called Prima applesauce. It was the best applesauce I've ever eaten. I don't believe I'll ever eat better than Prima applesauce. I miss it. That's probably obviously why he kept coming up in my mind, but then I considered further the importance Tom played in my life. Dean and I have talked a few times about, if we've looked back from where we are today, could we see evidence that God was preparing us for these truths? And I would say yes. I could now look back and see, and Tom was an important part of that. I remember sitting on the front porch of our house on Hartmetz, and right across the street from our house was the church that Beth and I and the kids went, and Beth's parents, Tom and June, went. And it was a little Baptist church full of great people. I still run into these people here in Evansville from time to time, and they're wonderful people, love them. Now, we wouldn't agree on a lot of the doctrine that is in Christendom, and that's okay. These people still deserve my affection, my love, and my fellowship. They were very well-meaning, intentful people in my life at those early years. And I still appreciate them a great deal, even though, like I said, we would find little to agree on in doctrine. But my father-in-law, I remember a specific time he and I were sitting on the front porch, and we were discussing something, and Tom pointed over at the church and said, "You realize God doesn't live in that building over there?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I know that." And he said, "Yeah, he does not have any need for the work that comes from man's hands. And he does not reside in a tabernacle made by hands." I didn't know he was quoting Acts 17:24. I think that's the scripture. I didn't know he was quoting that at that time. I was not learning, hadn't begun the journey on these truths yet. And I think back at how my father-in-law was sharing with me the importance now that he tabernacles in us. We have his spirit. And this is one of the reasons why, we don't have the need for church like the Jews did in the days of Israel and the synagogues. And so it was interesting that my father-in-law was sharing this, because it was a foundational thing that I remember going back to years later. Another thing my father-in-law gave me was a love of words and being precise about your words. I remember having a discussion with him one time, and he was telling me about the nomenclature of the American Jeep. And then he said, "Do you understand me, son?" I said, "About half the time. I do not understand why you use some of these words like nomenclature." And he smiled and he said, "Well, it's important to me, son. I want to use the most appropriate word to convey the meaning or message I'm sharing with an individual." And I never forgot that. And today I find in Scripture, God is not careless with words. God chooses the most appropriate word for meaning and for message. And I remember that from my father-in-law. And it's tremendous to realize that God had put this man in my life, and that neither one of us probably had any clue, but he was in my life to prepare me for truths coming up later on. And now my love of words and digging into words and the meaning of words comes a great deal from my father-in-law and my Father in heaven. I did want to read to you something kind of interesting along those lines. This is for instance, about the significance of words that God uses in Scripture. My wife brought this to me a number of years ago, the word tetelestai. Literally translated, the word tetelestai means "it is finished." The word occurs in John 19:28 and 19:30. These are the only two places in the New Testament where it occurs. In John 19:28, it is translated, "After this, when Jesus knew that all things were now completed, in order that the scripture might be fulfilled, he said, 'I thirst.' 2 verses later, he utters the word himself. Then, when he received the sour wine, Jesus said, 'It is finished.' And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit." The word tetelestai was also written on business documents or receipts in New Testament times to show indicating that a bill had been paid in full. Receipts are often introduced by the phrase, usually written in an abbreviated manner, tetelestai. The connection between receipt and what Christ accomplished would have been quite clear to John's Greek-speaking readership. So there's a perfect example of the perfect word being used to illustrate the complete work of the cross, that we can add nothing to it. The debt was paid in full. Those are the kinds of things that I appreciate from my father-in-law, and then also from my Father in heaven who provided Tom in my life. It's again one of those instances that Dean and I have pointed out that God is doing everything. He is providing us our circumstances, our experiences. Every good and bad thing that comes into our life is used by the Father to prepare us for another work at a later date. And, for we are his achievement, and he loves the work of his hands. And so he is always working with us with that in mind. The last thing I'd want to share was my wife wrote something that was put in the bulletin of my father-in-law's funeral. And I thought she did a fantastic job, and it explained Tom a great deal, and I'd like to share that with you now. Tom passed in October 14th of the year 2000. And this is what we shared with everyone in the bulletin. Soon after chilly winter temperatures yielded to cool spring rains, one could hear the distinctive pop-pop percussion of the John Deere as Dad broke ground for the garden. Neatly lined rows of plant life would soon replace the wild weeds of spring and the occasional volunteer squash or cornstalk. The vegetables and fruits that followed were to be enjoyed and shared, for he always planted with the intent to share. Dad's passion for gardening blossomed into a love of fruit trees. Many a walk was taken by mom, kids, grandkids, and other family members to check on the progress of plums, apricots, peaches, pears, and most certainly apples. Multiple trees resulted in references like the plum patch and Yellow D Hill. Whether vegetables or fruit, Dad's gardening mirrors the good news of the gospel. God prepares, nurtures, and provides us with the joy of salvation. He intends that it be shared. May Dad's model of sharing inspire each one of us to share the greatest fruit, Jesus Christ, with one who is hungry. Dad never wanted anyone to be hungry. A beautiful message for a beautiful man, someone I am truly grateful for. And once again, it was my Father in heaven who provided that very influential person in my life. Think about it. Think about your own lives. Think about the circumstances and the people he has brought into your life. Maybe they've exited your life, either through death or they've simply moved on. Think about the significance of them. And can you see how the Father has used them or a circumstance to improve your life or to bring you along to a greater understanding of his truths? I bet you can. Hey, this has been a great time. I've enjoyed sharing with you this morning. I'm hoping all of you have a great week. Loved the comments again last week. There was some really good ones, and I appreciated them. Dean would want you to know that he is very grateful for you guys, just as I am. And we'll get together real soon, and we'll see you again. Y'all take care. Love.